I'm Joe Devine and welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. A quick note before we get started with today's podcast. The series is now available to listen to on iTunes and Soundcloud as well as YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, a link to our iTunes page will be provided in the description. Under manager Leonardo Jardim, Monaco staged a radical shift in their player acquisition policy. From big spending to smart academy investment, a team stocked with youthful talent has now reached the latter stages of this season's Champions League. Today, I'm joined by Alex Stewart to discuss the tactics that have granted Monaco success, along with the environment that has enabled it. Alex, Monaco often use a 4-4-2, which is a system that we're all fairly familiar with, as it's dominated the English game, for a time a few years ago. The option of two strikers is beneficial for obvious reasons, and we've seen it with Leicester recently, inspired themselves by Atletico Madrid, another team that use a variant of that system. Why aren't we seeing this formation more often? And is it just simply a case of losing out in midfield if you have an additional striker?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that's why often when you see a 4-4-2, even, it's almost more of a 4-4-1-1. It's very important not to lose the midfield battle. And a lot of teams, when you're playing against a side that is playing a 4-2-3-1 or even a 3-5-2, there is clearly a numerical advantage to be had in that central area. So you sacrifice a certain degree of solidity through the centre by putting an additional striker up. Now, what you've seen teams like Leicester doing is having one of those strikers dropping very, very deep, and sometimes coming almost into a kind of midfield role to link the play. Atleti do the same sort of thing. So I think it's one of those questions where you're asking, really, does the formation that's written down on paper actually represent the positions that players take up on the field? With Monaco, obviously, Mbappe's got a lot of room to drop deep, to push out wide. So while it is nominally a 4-4-2, there's a great deal of fluidity and flexibility in that formation that actually means it's not clearly definitively a 4-4-2.
I suppose with Leicester as well, the other example that we just mentioned there, Okazaki acts as more of a supporting striker to Vardy, is that right?
Yeah, and Ulloa does the same thing. So, you're looking there at a player who is maybe quite fixed in their position and is looking to win aerial balls and play it through or drop deep. It's not massively dissimilar to, for example, playing someone like Fellaini in the 10 role. And they're a presence that draws the centre-backs out of position, wins balls, flick-ons, and obviously with Vardy's pace, he kind of feeds off that. So, again, 4-4-1-1, a little bit more than a 4-4-2.
I suppose you could argue then that back in the day where 4-4-2 the formation kind of dominated the Premier League, and I suppose in some cases it still does in the lower leagues, that football might have been slightly more end to end and a little bit more attacking, as both teams' midfields were, I suppose, more fragile, right?
Yeah, and I think where in the English game you had a much more direct style of football, playing up to the classic kind of big man, little man combination, where the central midfielders were really there just to kind of win the ball if it happened to fall in that position, and shift it out to the wide men or back to the fullbacks who would then launch those long raking passes forwards. I remember seeing it at Southampton where Peter Crouch would play alongside a smaller striker, and the two central midfielders really weren't playing through balls along the ground very much. It was kind of win it in the centre and shift it wide. So in that instance, a kind of slightly throwback, more direct style 4-4-2 is fine. Nowadays, where teams are a lot more fluid and are looking to play along the ground a lot more, it seems that you have to have that extra man in midfield if you're going to prosper.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because I think as you see formations develop from two strikers to, drawing it back to three midfielders, it seems that a lot of what teams are doing tactically is in an effort to try and negate what the other team is doing. And I think you could probably, I don't know if this is a winnable argument or not, but I think that you could argue that in the last 5 years or so, big games, big fixtures between two big teams that arguably should be, the kind of centre points of the season, and Manchester United, Man City, for example, other games like that are slightly more boring because I think, the midfield is congested, both teams are afraid of losing. I suppose maybe 10 years ago those games might have been more entertaining, but what I have noticed recently is that some of those big fixtures have been a little bit more end-to-end. I'm not sure if you saw it the other day, but I watched the second half of the recent El Clasico, and I was amazed by how end-to-end that was. And obviously it was coming to the end of the game. There was a red card that impacted that, for the last 10 or 20 minutes. So I suppose it is slightly different, but it was much more entertaining just from, the point of view of watching football. I suppose you could argue that it's entertaining to watch the teams tactically and how they can outperform each other or negate, the other team's attacking options. But I'm not sure if you would agree that it's more entertaining to watch those games that are end-to-end.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I'd say that the majority of people who watch football probably are watching it for goals rather than an Atletico Madrid defensive masterclass. I'm not sure how many of us tune in to really admire two solid banks of four rather than exciting goals and exciting attacking play. I think also you've got certain managers, and Jose Mourinho is the one who most obviously springs to mind here, who particularly in big games does seem to set out with a kind of a stifling mentality. What are the opposition's strengths and how do I negate those? So even in a game like Manchester United against Liverpool recently, not that recently, but earlier in the season, where Klopp's team were kind of going still at it hell for leather, United was set up just to shut that down. And if they could get a point, that's great. If they could get 3 points, that's even better. But it wasn't about making their own openings. It was about defending. I think in the Premier League, you've got managers, I would say particularly Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp, who are both attacking but also are not afraid to switch things around. You've got Conte and Wenger, who seem very much set in terms of what they're doing, and they don't tend to adapt enormously to what the opposition are up to. And then you've got Mourinho, who wants to shut it down and adapt to what the opposition are doing almost exclusively. And that, where you've got those big teams managed by people that are doing different stuff, it does create that kind of imbalance where games might well have a tendency to be about stifling rather than creativity.
Back to Monaco, I think what was interesting from the video was that Fabinho's role seemed to be perhaps the most important in the team, maybe alongside the fullbacks. In the video that the two fullbacks push very high and that Fabinho drops when necessary to fill in with the defence. Could it be argued that the team almost shifts to a kind of 3-3-4 formation at times when they're attacking?
Yeah, absolutely. If not almost a 2-4-4. Fabinho's got that mobility and the tactical awareness to see when he needs to drop back and fill in the gap. It's not something that happens all of the time. Sometimes Monaco are so attacking and they're managing to create those overloads that he actually doesn't need to go back and he can sit more centrally. I think he reminds me of Esteban Cambiasso in the Inter team that we looked at a few videos back under Mourinho in the treble-winning season. Cambiasso was, again, a very intelligent reader of the game and was able to drop back and fill in when required, when the fullbacks got forward. But that doesn't mean they're doing it all of the time. I think it's right. You need to have, when you've got such attacking fullbacks and when a lot of the width is coming from that, you need to have a player in central midfield who is able to drop back in either between the two centre-backs or in Fabinho's case, I think largely because he's a converted right-back effectively into one of those full-back positions. It just gives a solidity that otherwise the team might be lacking. They might get exposed on the counter.
Staying with Fabinho, as you just mentioned, he's a converted right-back. Originally that's where he played with the team. And now we've we've seen crossover before between the central midfield role and the fullback role, and perhaps the epitome of this was Pep Guardiola's use of Philipp Lahm at Bayern Munich, as Lahm was often asked to cover both positions concurrently. What are the benefits of asking fullbacks to drift into central midfield positions when in possession? Because I note that Guardiola's still trying to do this with City, although perhaps the fullbacks aren't quite of the quality that are required for that system to work.
Yeah, I think what you get, particularly when you've got deep possession, where perhaps it's either from a goal kick or it's been won, in quite deep in your defensive third, the centre backs can split quite wide, so possibly right to the edge of the penalty area, behind the line of the penalty box, and the fullbacks can then come in, and that creates quite a nice square of passing options ahead of the goalkeeper, and it means that the goalkeeper doesn't have to boot it long. It also means that it's easier to keep possession within a square than it is to try and play it forwards and then have a line in front of that, because it's much easier to cut off the passing lanes with one or even two forwards. If you've got a square, it's much harder to win the ball back for the opposition. I think fullbacks are such important players in the modern game. This is partly to do with the use of inside forwards. It's partly to do with the fact that a lot of width now is provided by fullbacks, and I guess it's quite natural for them to find themselves in a position that's closer almost to a sort of central midfield, or, as we talked about before, almost in a kind of 2-4 something formation with the centre backs dropping quite deep. So they're closer to where they need to be. If you look at positional maps for a lot of top teams, it's really not unusual to see the fullbacks level with or even ahead of the central midfielders in terms of their average position in the game. And I think having players like Fabinho or Philipp Lahm, who you mentioned, and Pep always refers to him as the most intelligent footballer he played with, someone who's got that versatility, who understands where they need to be when they need to be there, who can fill in defensively but has the engine to get forward, and understands where they are in relation to those other players, is absolutely crucial for a top level team. I think that's one of the reasons Pep has not necessarily been able to implement his philosophy quite so well as he wanted at City, because in Sagna and Clichy, that they're not top level fullbacks now. Kolarov, he's sort of umdenard with whether to use him at left back or left central defence. So I wouldn't be surprised if City strengthened in that area.
You talk about Monaco's conversion rate as well, which is currently twice the regularity of the average in Europe's top 5 leagues. It's difficult to account for this, obviously, but if you had to speculate, what might be the reasons for this, and how do we account for statistical blips like this, beyond the tactics or the layout of the team?
That's a really, really interesting question, because that kind of gets to the heart of what you try and say with data and analysing football. One way of looking at it is to say you don't account for it. It is a blip, that there will be, after the end of the season, what statisticians would call a regression to the mean, which is between 9 and 10% conversion rate, historically as an average. And that's that. And, sometimes players just have a really good streak. Sometimes teams just have a really good streak. One of the longer term things that you would look at to see if it's in some way sustainable is chance creation. So if a team's creating a lot of chances and it's also converting a lot, then obviously it's going to score many, many goals. That chance conversion rate you would expect to drop, but if you can create more chances in the first instance, the level of goals scored could still stay the same, or at least be quite similar. So I would be looking to say, if Monaco are going to try and sustain this success, don't expect them to have such a high chance conversion rate next season, but look to see whether they're creating more and whether it sort of balances out that way. Sometimes teams are just hot. Sometimes players just get in the right position and score shots that you would not expect them to. Sometimes I guess there's kind of an energy and a verve to what's happening. It's a really, really difficult thing to explain.
I suppose that's the undying question of managers, right? How do they create those, scenarios to allow that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Chance creation is sustainable and something that you can grow. Shot conversion is not sustainable over anything longer necessarily than a season, and not you can work at shooting and stuff like that, but there are so many variables in whether a shot is turned into a goal. The position, the strength of the shot, the position of the goalkeeper, the position of the defence, what else is going on, that it's really, really hard to work at making that, setting yourself a goal of, I'm going to be a 20% converting team for the whole of next season. You just can't do it. You're much better off trying to create more chances.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the user comments on the Monaco video now. Geminix365 reminds us that Monaco are in the semi-finals of their domestic cup competition. I hope that's still the case by the time this podcast is released. I'm not sure, I haven't checked. But potentially still in the running for an historic treble, which I believe would be the first in France. So that would be something. A number of commenters have also asked us to discuss Monaco's defensive frailties and how they might be hurt by opposition teams. So I thought this might be an interesting opportunity to talk about their upcoming game against Juventus in the semi-finals of the Champions League and how they might face up defensively against that team.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Monaco have invested, less money than they did a couple of seasons ago, but where they've put the money has not necessarily been, in the kind of the core central defensive areas and in goal. I've never quite been convinced by Subasic, who's the first choice goalkeeper, the Croatian international. Jemison is developing well, and certainly has a good range of passing, which is very helpful for Monaco when they're seeking to transition. Andrea Raggi has been at the club for quite some time. I think he's 31, 32 now. And again, has never really convinced as a kind of top-level centre-back. So I would suggest that Monaco's defensive stance is going to be by attacking. I don't think they're going to want to try and sit back and soak up pressure, because their game style is not predicated on doing that. They're used to rolling over teams with this incredibly fast, precise attacking football. And I think against Juventus, who, let's not forget, are a really, really good quality team, I think they're just going to stick with what they know, and try and get at them, to use a rather old-fashioned expression. When you've got a team that is producing so many goals, producing so many chances, has that understanding, that interplay kind of down pat, it would seem silly for them to kind of withdraw and play Bakayoko and Fabinho much deeper than they do usually, that kind of thing. I can't see them doing that. I might be wrong, but I think they would go for it because I think it's probably their best chance.
Nemajneb something, and I should clarify that something is that person's actual name. I'm not just saying that in place of a word I can't pronounce. Says, I think that the most precious and exciting man at Monaco is Jardim. He has a truly remarkable ability to adapt his teams, his systems, and his players. And the commentator goes on to say that Jardim knows what to give his players and when, which is an interesting point given the club's philosophy with regards to looking after the players and treating them as individuals rather than assets, I think. We note at the beginning of the video that Monaco have shifted their player acquisition policy quite drastically in recent years, from big spending under a very wealthy owner to a revised focus on academy talent as a result of financial fair play infringements. And there's a really interesting piece that was written in The Guardian. The name of the journalist I have forgotten, but we linked the piece in the description of this podcast on YouTube and on iTunes. So if you want to go and read it, you can search for it. I think it's the most recent Monaco thing on there anyway. The journalist sort of charts the history of the club and to give us an understanding of why their new focus on academy talent is actually not so new. It's very interesting, and I wasn't aware of it, but according to the journalist, the reason that Monaco have always focused in some way on academy is as a result of the demography of Monaco, in that I think there's only 30,000 people who live there. There's next to no teams for kids under 9 years old or so, and I think there's a FIFA ruling that professional clubs aren't allowed to approach or sign kids under a certain age. I think it's 14 or 15 or something. So Monaco were in a quite difficult position, from the beginning of their club, which was in the 1920s. So they've always had to establish a very strong scouting network across France, perhaps more so than other teams, because they haven't got kids playing football in their local area, and they don't have those domestic leagues to so as local kids to kind of choose from. So I am informed now that whilst it seems that Monaco's move to funding the academy is a kind of new thing, I think it's actually more reverting to a system that they were used to before they started spending a lot of money. And it's quite interesting actually as well. They talk a lot about how Jardim and the youth coach, whose name I've forgotten, treat the players as individuals, and they have not only excellent training facilities, but they also have excellent support networks in place. The kids also benefit from the fact that they get to remain in their original environment at home until they're 14 or 15, based on the fact that Monaco can't sign them legally until after then. So I think it's interesting what we're seeing now, a number of players, young players coming through the academy who all seem to be very well adjusted, who all seem to enjoy playing with each other, who seem to benefit from that strong support network there and the positive coaching. I know that the head of youth development there was at PSG for 11 years as well, so the club have spent money on their academy, and it's obvious that that's something that they want to do going forward. It's clearly working. I know we've talked a little bit about the conversion rates, how sustainable is it, and it'll be interesting to see if some of those players do transfer to other clubs, how they work out. Mbappe is the obvious example of a player who lots of the big clubs in Europe are very interested in. But I wonder, Alex, if that's perhaps one of the things that we could think about as creating the environment for those statistical blips and those kind of hot streaks, that the environmental factors. And it reminds me of that Nagelsmann quote that we talked about a while back, with management being 70% social competence. If Monaco have created this environment in which the players are thriving as individuals and socially as well as on the pitch, perhaps that's one of the things that a football club can do to kind of create the environment that is hopeful of those statistical blips happening. Do you think perhaps that's what's happened?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Jardim is an interesting guy. He's had a career starting in Portugal, but he began management at the age of 27, which again, sort of maybe echoes Nagelsmann a little bit, and seems to have overachieved with smaller clubs, and occasionally, like at Olympiacos, got sacked, even though he was doing really, really well with them. So, this is clearly a young, thoughtful manager who's able to get results out of perhaps younger players. He worked a lot with at Porto when he was there, and teams that are maybe less well resourced. Let's not pretend that Monaco are poor by any stretch of the imagination. They do have less money than PSG, but building a team and convincing a group of young players to pull together in a particular kind of style is obviously something that Jardim is good at. Doing that within a club structure that is predicated on developing those sorts of players, exactly like you said in that article, focusing on that. I think the massive investment of money that led to the signing of people like James Rodriguez was the blip. That was as unsustainable as their shot conversion rate, probably. But a lot of this stuff, I guess, is what we would call intangibles. you can't measure team spirit. You can't measure confidence. You can't measure whether players have bought into a philosophy or not. You can only see results and infer from those results that there's something happening in the chemistry of that group of players.
Is that where Football Manager falls down? Just to take this on a tangent, because I think, the players reacted poorly or well to this speech, and you can gauge team spirit. There's a metric for chemistry.
Yes. Well, I know in FM17 they get really grumpy really quickly, so that's possibly fair.
I think you could argue that in the future perhaps we can track those things, but the data isn't obvious to our human eyes, Alex.
I think it's like a customer satisfaction survey, isn't it? Unless you sent out anonymized thing saying rate your manager's ability to G you up on a scale of 1 to 10, it would be hard. But and obviously when players make public pronouncements, it's quite rare for players to say, well, the manager came in at halftime and said something, and we all thought he was a bit of an asshole for it. Players they're sent out there to say, we're all working really hard, and I'm pleased for whoever scored, and we all just want to keep winning and stuff. So then they're not stupid. They're not going to reveal stuff that's happening or reveal issues. And I'm always dubious of what I see in the press about people orchestrating sort of protests against managers or what have you. I think what you can see is when players are attempting stuff that is difficult, or are not showing off, but are demonstrating a repertoire of skills that require confidence in order to try and carry off, and to do so with an understanding that maybe their teammates will cover for them if it doesn't work out, or that their teammates will back them to do the thing that they're trying to do and therefore be in the right position to receive the ball. On that note, I would mention, I think, the improved performances of Paul Pogba recently. Some of the stuff Pogba's been trying and achieving in probably his last sort of 5 or 6 games, that to me says there is a player who has settled in and is now confident. And so maybe that's the area that we can look at and sort of try to infer from that whether there is some kind of chemistry, whether there is a confidence and a settledness to those players. And then once we've said, yes, we think that is what's happening, then we can look at why that is, and maybe developing a youth system in that way, looking after players' mental welfare as much as their technical and physical welfare is very much part of what needs to be done at a club like Monaco, and is why they're doing so well.
Alex, thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe.